In this video, I want to talk about the cerebrum. In a previous video, I showed you a side view, a lateral view of a human brain. Of course, we could look at the human brain from other angles as well. We could have a front view, a rear view, a superior or a top view, as well as an inferior view. Let's go and map on some of the structures that we already know about. So previously I talked about the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and in the brainstem said that from the side view we could see the pons and the medulla. Many of these structures are evident in these other views as well. For example, in the frontal view we can see the cerebellum, we can see the brainstem with the pons and the medulla, and then we can see the cerebrum. But here we see something that wasn't evident from the side, and that's that the cerebrum is actually split into two parts. There are two cerebral hemispheres, a right cerebral hemisphere and a left cerebral hemisphere, and they are separated by a deep fissure. We call this the longitudinal fissure. We can see a lot of these structures from the rear view as well. Here's the longitudinal fissure, and now we can also see that between the cerebrum and the cerebellum there's another fissure. This is called the transverse fissure. In the superior view, we can see the longitudinal fissure. We can't see any of the cerebellum or the brainstem. In the inferior view, though, if we looked up at the brain from the bottom, we'd see a lot. We'd see the longitudinal fissure. We'd see in the brainstem the pons and the medulla. But now in the brainstem, we can also see the midbrain, and we can even see a small part of the hypothalamus as well. In addition, in this image, we can see these structures, the olfactory bulbs and the cranial nerve. Neuroscientists often break the cerebrum into several different functional lobes, and there are 4 lobes that are commonly described. There's the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And these are defined largely by the bones that make up the skull that lie on top of these regions, and also by some other landmarks. In addition to these 4 lobes, there are 2 more structures that we don't see, but you'll see these terms used, and I want to introduce them now. And the first is a structure that we would see if we took the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and we pulled them apart, or in this case what I did was just to paste a new image on top of it. And what I hope you can see is that the wrinkled surface of the cerebrum extends down into this groove, and we have this wrinkled surface here. This region of the cerebrum is called the insula. If we were, instead of looking at a side view of the brain, to look at a mid view of the brain, like cut it in half and lay it out, then we could see one more structure. So there are the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, but there is also this other continuous set of tissue that wraps from the frontal lobe through the parietal lobe and even pack around the brainstem to the temporal lobe. And because it is a continuous sheet of tissue, it sometimes gets its own name. It's called the limbic lobe. How do we know where one lobe starts and the other one ends? To tell you about the landmarks that separate them, I need to introduce one more little bit of terminology. Remember that when I was talking about the surface of the brain, I said that there are these ridges and grooves. Well, they get names. The general name given to the raised surface of the cerebrum is a gyrus, plural, gyri. And one of the grooves or crevices is called a sulcus, plural, sulci. Really deep sulci are sometimes called fissures. This terminology is a little bit hard to remember. When I was learning this, I came up with the mnemonic of saying, gee, it's great to be on a gyrus, and oh no, I'm going to go sulk in a sulcus. And that's worked for me for 20 years, so you might find that useful as well. So can we then look for gyri or sulci that will separate the lobes? We can. One important landmark is called the lateral sulcus. It's also called the lateral fissure because it's a deep fissure. It's also called the Sylvian fissure, named after the anatomist who first described it. And this separates the temporal lobe from other parts of the brain. Another important landmark is called the central sulcus, also called the fissure of Rolando, again named after the anatomist who first described it. Still, other sulci get names. So for example, in the frontal lobe, there is a precentral sulcus. It gets its name because it's the sulcus that's in front of the central sulcus. There's a postcentral sulcus in the parietal lobe. And of course, the raised surfaces are called gyri, and they get name. We'll call this the precentral gyrus. It's part of the frontal lobe. But this is the postcentral gyrus, which would lie in the parietal lobe. There are still other structures. For example, in the temporal lobe, we have the superior temporal sulcus, which separates the superior temporal gyrus from the middle temporal gyrus. There's also an inferior temporal gyrus. We can see still more structures if we look at a superior view. Just to orient you, the front of the brain is at the top. This is the longitudinal fissure. Here's the central sulcus. You can find it on either side of the brain. Precentral sulcus, postcentral sulcus, and again remember, the raised surfaces would then be called the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. Within the frontal lobe, there are more conserved sulci. There's a superior frontal sulcus, a medial frontal sulcus defining superior frontal gyrus, medial frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. There are also sulci in the parietal lobe and in the occipital lobe, and these help to define those structures as well. Finally, because the cerebral surface folds down into the longitudinal fissure, when we look at that view of the brain, we can see that there are conserved sulci and gyri there as well. So remember I talked about the limbic lobe. Well, there's another name for this. There's a sulcus which separates that limbic lobe from the rest of the brain. It's called the cingulate sulcus. And so another name for that surface of tissue that wraps around is the cingulate gyrus. In the occipital lobe, we have the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates the parietal from the occipital lobe. And there's also a conserved structure called the calcarine sulcus. The fact that we can find these structures in adult brains from many different individuals raises the question, well, how do they originate in development, and when do they originate in development? Well, let me tell you a little bit about that. Remember that human development takes about 40 weeks, and around 13 weeks is when we start to find the first landmarks showing up. The lateral fissure starts to form, and the cerebrum will start to fold. The bottom row of this figure shows you medial views, and here we can see the calcarine sulcus starting to form around 15 weeks of development. And the parieto-occipital sulcus, which will separate the parietal and the occipital lobes, also forms. So we find these structures, again, being set up during development. Well, let me close this video with a little bit of a challenge for you. If these structures are really conserved in brain after brain after brain, then you ought to be able to identify them. And so I've got a bit of a challenge for you. Can you identify the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes in these pictures? Can you find a lateral fissure? Can you find the central sulcus? Can you find the postcentral and the precentral gyri? Can you see other conserved sulci and gyruses? Just to make it a little bit more challenging, I'll point out that these are all views of the right side of the brain. These are right hemispheres, and the images that I showed you earlier in the video were left hemispheres. But if you've got these landmarks down, you'll be able to do it.